Hi, everybody. I'm Lucy Beadnell, the Director of Advocacy for the ARC of Northern Virginia, and we are so excited to have you all here today. The ARC of Northern Virginia is really interested in presenting on this topic, which we're calling Top 10 Things to Consider Before Moving to Virginia If You Have a Developmental Disability. Northern Virginia is such a transient area. We get many thousands of inquiries from people with disabilities and their families over the course of a year, and a lot of them have to do with what it would be like to move to the area. And so we thought that it would be a great idea to get some of this both presented live and recording for folks in the future, since I know these are tricky things to figure out. We like to think the ARC of Northern Virginia is there for the ungoogleable. So we'll take a look here at what we're going to talk about today. First, kind of a general overview of how Virginia compares to other states. And then a settlement agreement Virginia has going on with the Department of Justice that's shaping a lot of Virginia's disability services now and for the foreseeable future. Then we're going to talk a little bit about funding streams, how things are paid for, both at the federal, state, and then at the local level. We'll talk about how those would move in and out of state or not. Then we'll talk about legal authority, and we'll most specifically be looking at guardianship and then other alternatives to guardianship and how they can move with folks or not. And then we'll talk a little bit about special education and school services and IEPs. And then lastly, about special needs trust and ABLE accounts. Absolutely feel free to put questions in the chat anytime as we, or in the Q&A box anytime as we go along, and I will get to them, but we'll go ahead and dive right in. All right, so how does Virginia look in comparison to other states? Though in many ways, Virginia is a wealthy state, by and large, we don't compare well to other states when you look at disability services in specific. The overwhelming majority of services for people with disabilities are state-based. And so you're looking at not just is your state doing well overall, but does your state put a lot of money and effort into disability services in specific? One of the really great reports I love that comes out every year or every other year or so is called the Case for Inclusion. It's put out by a national group called United Cerebral Palsy, and it gives each state a scorecard where you can look in that state and see, are people funded in community or are people sitting on waiting lists? Do people have access to real competitive jobs or only day programs? Do people have access to integrated living or just group homes? Or are they just home with their families? It gives a good measure of, is quality of life and funding available for folks with disabilities across various states? Pretty consistently, Virginia has ranked at the bottom of the 50 states plus the district on this ranking. And right now we're the 39th most inclusive state out of 51. So we're not doing tremendously well. Another really good overall comparison is that the University of Colorado puts out a regular report called The State of the States. And the State of the States doesn't rank states in the same way the Case for Inclusion does, but it gives a lot of state-based data. So if you were looking at moving to Virginia, or you're in Virginia and you're looking at comparing it to another state, those are two really good reports to give you a sense of how does one state compare to another. As a caveat here, like I'll say, for example, the Case for Inclusion for a number of years has ranked Arizona as the most inclusive state. One of the reasons for that is they really don't rely on institutional care at all, and they also have no waiting list for their waiver services. So that means if a child is 2 years old and they get a new diagnosis, they can start getting services right away. Obviously, that makes a huge difference in life for both that child and their family and their support networks. So that part really matters. With that being said, if you talk to your average family in Arizona, they would certainly say, it's not like every day is sunshine and roses and we've never had to fight for anything and everything's super easy. It's all relative, right? At the end of the day, as long as we are going to look at solely public, meaning free or very, very low cost to the person with a disability or their family services, that alone is meant to provide some core and basic services. But what really provides a good quality of life is relationships and people around you. And you can be in a state with very poor services, but if you've got a good support network around you who helps you find a great job and who's there for you on your birthday and does all those things in our life that gives us meaning, those are other things to consider. So I think for someone who's thinking about coming to Virginia, it is important to know that statistically speaking, we don't do well, but that's not the only consideration. We have a lot of families who talk about relocating to Northern Virginia, and in comparison to the district or Maryland, By and large, the district in Maryland do tend to have more inclusive services, Maryland more in specific. So we have a lot of families who choose to live in the Montgomery County, Maryland area, which is similar in terms of demographics and size and wealth and capacity to Northern Virginia, but offers more services. So just some things to think about if you have a choice on where exactly to go, recognizing that not everybody does. Okay, so the next thing I mentioned is our Department of Justice settlement. We are now 39th, like I just talked about, and in terms of inclusive states, we used to be 47th. So in some ways, we have made some significant progress, and a lot of that is tied to a settlement agreement that Virginia has with the Department of Justice. In the early 2000s, the Department of Justice came to investigate Virginia with a lot of concerns about the way that we really still heavily relied on very old style institutional care and offered very little in community settings, and especially very little in community settings that were integrated. So for example, we had a lot of people with disabilities who only lived and worked with other people with disabilities and paid staff all the time. And the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division said, that's okay as an option, but it really shouldn't be your only option, Virginia. So over a course of a few years, they came to a settlement agreement with Virginia that was designed to bring Virginia more into compliance with a host of civil rights laws over the course of a decade. This settlement agreement has now been fully in effect for a decade, and we're not where we need to be yet. So we're not done with a settlement agreement. There's no longer a really clear end date in mind, but everybody involved has said, we're going to keep working on this until we all agree that Virginia has met the terms and conditions of this agreement. And a lot of the things that are remaining have to do with quality control and quality measurement and things that in the past Virginia hadn't done and require big systems, both to be built up and to be used over time to make sure that they're accurate, to make sure we know what we're doing here. So if you're thinking about moving to Virginia, know that the settlement agreement 10 years ago was a big glaring red flag that Virginia was doing incredibly poorly relative to other states. We had a target on our back, so Department of Justice came here. At the same time, we've been working very hard for a decade to continue to improve, and we are under the gun, if you will, to continue making those improvements. And we have seen more integrated housing and more integrated employment opportunities, more services for folks who are on the waiting list, more control and oversight than ever. Again, that's all relative, but we have seen some significant improvements in the last decade. Okay, so that's kind of the Virginia is a big picture piece, and now we'll look at dollars. Okay, so funding streams matter a great deal because where the money comes from determines where the money can go to follow the person. So we're going to look at three types of funding streams. First, federal funding. So that's money that covers the whole country, and that's programs like Social Security. So if you have SSI or SSDI benefits, that would be federal funding. Medicare, and to some degree Medicaid, and some federal housing vouchers. If you have what used to be called a Section 8 voucher and is now called a housing choice voucher, that's administered through the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development. The next kind of funding is state-based funding, and that's programs like Medicaid waiver that are state and federal partnerships, Medicaid health insurance, unemployment benefits, job coaching, and state vocational rehab is what that's often called, and then local funding. And this doesn't exist in all places. In Virginia as a state, local funding to augment what's missing in federal and state funding really only exists in some parts of Northern Virginia. So in specific, Fairfax and Arlington, most prominently, Alexandria to some small degree, and occasionally Prince William and Loudoun County. So if someone is thinking about moving to Virginia, one of the most important things to know is, what do you have now and who's paying for it? And that will give you a good sense about whether or not it would transfer or move very easily with the person. And so let's dive into that a little bit more. So federal funding may move with you, right? Federal funding is money for the whole country. So if someone's moving within the country, there are chances that it will move with you, so long as the person continues to stay updated with contact information. So for example, if you're moving from California to Virginia and you had Social Security benefits in California, then your job as soon as you get to Virginia, within 30 days, is to notify the Social Security office, hey, I've got a new address. A piece here that's tricky is though, Eligibility for those Social Security programs is federal, meaning if you qualify in one place, you should qualify in another. Some states offer additional payments. So for comparison, right now, the SSI benefit amount, Social Security benefit amount for people with disabilities in Virginia is $794 a month. There are places in the state where, or excuse me, in the country where people receive SSI amounts that are higher and that are lower than that. So even though the person's SSI eligibility may transfer, they're going to be getting the new benefit amount for whatever state they're moving to, $794 a month in the case of Virginia. If the person has Medicaid, that's a different kind of situation, because even though Medicaid is a federal program and funded a lot with federal money, it's run by states, and states set different eligibility for Medicaid. So it is likely that someone who has Medicaid in one state will be able to come to Virginia and apply for Medicaid and get it, but it's not guaranteed. Virginia did ultimately decide to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. So a lot of people who are low income with disabilities have access to Medicaid in Virginia, but not everybody. HUD housing vouchers, like I talked about, used to be called Section 8 vouchers, often move with the person. First of all, make sure it absolutely is a HUD voucher, that federal funded voucher. And then as you move, you have to make sure that wherever you're going, the local housing office is willing to administer it, is willing to work with it and run it. So even if someone has a voucher, let's say they live in Chicago and they're thinking about moving to Virginia, that voucher could theoretically move with them all over the state or all over the country even, but they have to contact the housing authority. So in Fairfax, the Fairfax Housing Authority, for example, where they're moving, and say, hey, do you all have capacity and ability to accept and administer my voucher? If I move, can I still use this? And you've got to get confirmation that that's going to happen. All right, next we're going to look at some state funding. State funding will not move with you because it comes from state tax dollars. When you move from one state and stop paying taxes there, they are not generally willing to send their tax money to other states to follow the person. So what does that mean? If a family has a Medicaid waiver in one state, and waivers are that tool that provide funding for care attendance, nursing, job supports, kind of community-based services. If they've got that in one state and they move to another state, the waiver does not move with them. It is really exciting to note that for the first time ever, I believe, there's a bill proposed in Congress, or being proposed in the fall of 2021, called the Home and Community-Based Services Access Act, that would allow movement between the states. But like getting any bill through Congress, let alone one that's incredibly expensive, it's going to be a big lift. So if that's something that sounds important to you, certainly stay tuned with the ARC National and the ARC of Northern Virginia as we work on advocacy for that. But it is by no means guaranteed. And even if it was, it would not be an immediate fix. So right now, if you're going to move to Virginia or from Virginia, your waiver will not be moving with you. In whatever state you're landing, you're going to have to establish a permanent address and then apply for waiver services. A couple of years ago, Virginia passed a law saying that if you're a military family and you were just waiting for a waiver, you never even got services here, you were just waiting and waiting and waiting, and you're leaving the state, or country for that matter, but intend to come back to Virginia, you can stay on the waiting list and essentially kind of hold your place in line, so to speak. I don't know that that's a tremendous benefit for military families, but it does save you the trouble of having to totally reapply and start from scratch if a family comes back to Virginia. But remember, that's just for staying on the waiting list. That's not a guarantee of actual waiver services. Another thing that is federally based but state administered is vocational rehab. So there's federal law saying all states have to have what's called a vocational job rehab, help for people with disabilities program. So in Virginia, ours is called DARS, and it's run through the Department of Aging and Rehab Services. That's the DARS acronym. And so oftentimes there's a wait for people with disabilities to get a job coach through DARS. And that job coach is the person who would help you do things like write a resume, practice interview skills, find for jobs, obtain employment, learn your job, help you maintain your job if you have a disability. Those services are, like I said, state-based and usually free or very, very low cost for the person with a disability. But if you have those services in one place, that money and that eligibility is not going to translate to the next state that you move to. So in Virginia, you'd have to get your address here and then apply for DARS services or job coaching services here, and then wait on what is, generally speaking, a relatively short waiting list, and then to get services. Medicaid, like we talked about, has different financial eligibility from state to state. So I can't guarantee that if you are eligible for Medicaid in one state, you will be eligible in Virginia, though that is often the case. There is no waiting list for Medicaid. Once you apply for Medicaid in Virginia, the Department of Social Services that runs that application is supposed to have 45 calendar days to process it. Not working days, calendar days to process it and get you enrolled. So important to know, if you've got a loved one who, for example, relies on nursing or really intense medical care, moving here, best case scenario is going to be a 45-day gap before you even get Medicaid. And then you have to identify a service provider, a nursing provider, for example, and then hire and line up nurses and then get them into the house. So if you're coming to a state like Virginia, you need to be prepared for the fact that there's going to be a gap just by the nature of moving in large bureaucracies before services are back in place, even if you're looking at something that doesn't really have a waiting list. Okay, and the last in our funding section here, local funding, of course, doesn't move with you. Like we talked about, lots of places don't have it, but in Northern Virginia, some places do. And in Northern Virginia, that local funding is usually for folks who are people who are waiting for those Medicaid waivers, and often people who have graduated from school at age 22 or above, since folks with disabilities can stay in public schools till 22, and don't have funding for day or employment supports on an ongoing basis because they don't have a waiver. So some Northern Virginia counties have said, we'll use local tax dollars, knowing we want these people to be working, to have meaningful day and employment activities, and we want them to be successful, and we've invested so much in them in the school system, we'll use some local tax dollars to pay for the exact same day and employment options they would have under the waiver, or in some cases, even more flexible options than they would have under the waiver, so that they don't have to sit home and graduate to the couch. That funding isn't guaranteed. Every single year, the localities have to pass their budgets and have to agree to fund the new people who come on board meeting that. So if you're looking at a situation where you'd be moving to Virginia with someone who's either near 22 or is already over 22, right away, you'd be contacting your local, what's called Community Services Board, and saying, hey, what do you think are the likelihoods that we could get some local funding for employment supports, for meaningful daytime supports, for those kinds of things, and having that conversation. And that's your best hope for relatively fast services getting put in place. Historically speaking, Prince William and Loudoun County have rarely had money like this, and definitely not as consistent as other parts of Northern Virginia. And as you leave Northern Virginia, I don't know of any part of the state that has ever had funding like this or plans to do so. Okay, so now we'll move on to legal authority. Guardianship, the process where you go to circuit court and a parent or someone else is appointed as a permanent substitute decision maker for the person with a disability, is in state-based law. There are some states that have agreements with each other saying, here's my enter. If you put guardianship in place here, we'll recognize it there. Virginia is not one of those states. So if you put guardianship in place in Virginia, or are moving to Virginia from somewhere else, you're going to have to get a new guardianship order once you land and settle where you're going to be. The guardianship order matters for the state where the person with a disability is living. So let's say the family with the person with a disability lives in Virginia, and the person with a disability wants to stay, but the family is moving to New Hampshire. Then that Virginia guardianship agreement is still valid because the person with a disability is still living in Virginia. But once that person leaves Virginia, you're going to need a new order for wherever that person is ultimately going to be staying. And that's the same process and same expense as it was wherever you were. In Northern Virginia, at least for attorney fees to put guardianship in place, I'd say $3,000-ish is a pretty fair estimate for how much that would cost. Certainly you could find things for less or more if you worked hard at it. And in other parts of the state, I would say that would likely be a little bit less money. Northern Virginia's cost of living is higher. By comparison, things like a power of attorney or supported decision-making move fluidly with a person. A power of attorney is a much more simplified legal document that where guardianship says the person with the disability does not have the capacity to make decisions. All of those rights are removed and given to someone else. A power of attorney instead says this person may need some significant help making decisions. Here is the person who's going to help them understand their choices, make their choices, and implement their choices. Much more cost effective to put in place, usually a few $100s if you have an attorney do it, or free if you use customizable templates online or other kinds of tools. Virginia doesn't even require our powers of attorney to be notarized. So if you're moving to Virginia, you can download or bring an existing power of attorney, and so long as it is signed by the person with a disability and the person they want helping them, you're all set. Make sure obviously you have plenty of copies and you're giving them out to doctors and banks and wherever else you're going to be using it, but then you're pretty much good to go. We talk a lot about supported decision-making, which is when the person with a disability has a selected team around them of people who help them understand and make choices. One of the tools of that team could be a power of attorney. So that idea of a customized team moves flawlessly with the person. As we have seen in the times of COVID, those teams are able to function over incredibly long distances through virtual communication, your FaceTime and your Zoom and your chat and your Facebook groups and whatever else it is that you have. So all those kinds of things should move very nicely with the person. And any other long-term planning documents, you'll have to look because state laws vary in terms of inheritance and rights and all kinds of things. So generally speaking, if you have a document written by an attorney in one state, it's a good idea to have it reviewed by an attorney in the state where you're going to settle. So we're going to move on to special education. And this is a tricky area. Special education tries to move with you. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, is the most important law on education for students with disabilities. It's a federal law and it covers students all the way up through their end of school, like we talked about at age 22. But it is implemented, meaning put in place and run by states and localities. So even though the rules are the same at the federal level, in reality, things don't function the same from one place to another. So if a student is moving from, let's say, Kansas this time, and they have an IEP, their individualized education plan, that's working really well for them, and they move to Northern Virginia, technically that IEP from Kansas is still in place exactly as it was until a new IEP is signed with their team in Virginia. With that being said, any gray areas in that IEP, anything that's not exactly spelled out, any assumptions about how things were going to be implemented, you certainly can't assume the new school is going to do those things in the same exact way. And even things that are in black and white terms, the school may try and show, oh, we're doing this in an equivalent way that's different. So the IEP, like I said, should initially travel with the student, but in reality, that doesn't mean a whole lot because right away the new school system is likely to say, okay, here's how we're going to implement this IEP, and we're going to need new assessments to maintain the services that you have now or to put in place different services as are appropriate here. And they may draw different conclusions about the students' needs and abilities. So really important thing to think about. We do lots of work connecting families with paid advocates and attorneys to help them navigate that process, which is certainly an option. Another thing to keep in mind is that laws and regulations on diplomas are not really clearly spelled out in IDEA, meaning they can vary by state. So just a couple of years ago in Virginia, we made it possible for students who didn't pass standards of learning exams to otherwise show competency in core subjects to get a standard diploma so they could go on to college. Some states may not have that in place, right? Another question we get a lot is, I'm moving to Virginia or Northern Virginia in specific, what's the best school? And I think you can talk to parents in any school and find a big wide range of thoughts and opinions. I can tell you that within Virginia, there's an incredible range in terms of the resources available to school and what teachers are paid. So in the southern part of the state, a starting salary in the high 30,000s a year would be average, and in Northern Virginia, more like double that. So certainly that means some school districts are more able to attract teachers who have lots of experience, who have master's degrees, who are award winners in other kinds of ways. Not that that's the only indicator of quality, but it's something to think about. We have also seen very consistently that within a school, different philosophies changed on inclusive education and services in general as principals or vice principals change. If you get a really strong team member from another school, sometimes parents have a great school year or 2 school years because they're working with a core group of teachers who really get their kid. And within the same school, the next few years are awful because the teachers they had weren't a good fit, right? So there is no answer I can give you because it doesn't exist about what is the best school. Northern Virginia is very tightly populated, unlike the rest of the state. So in Northern Virginia, making sure that you tour the schools and know how fragile boundary lines are, living in one neighborhood versus another can dramatically change what your child's homeschool are, can make a big difference. There are a few hub schools for students with disabilities in Northern Virginia, especially students 18 to 22 who are without same age peers in high school. And those schools are kind of based in the Alexandria and Springfield areas. They're called Davis and Pulley Center. There is hub schools in Northern Virginia for students who are deaf and hard of hearing, and a few others, but by and large, students with disabilities and typically developing peers tend to do better at inclusive classrooms. So we would recommend, like contact the principal, talk to the local school about whether or not that school is doing well with inclusion. Ask to talk to other parents, ask to get on PTA listservs, those kinds of things. Now with virtual connection, almost all PTA groups have Facebook pages and listservs and things that they'd be happy to allow families to join in advance. Okay, and so now we'll talk about money. So special needs trust and ABLE accounts are really important for someone with a disability, no matter where they're living, to help them save money, because programs like Medicaid, Medicaid waiver, Social Security, housing vouchers, food stamps, a whole host of them care how much money you have in the bank. And in order for someone with a disability to avoid having to live in poverty forever, to get some basic services, they have to move that money to something like a special needs trust or an ABLE account. Special needs trust and ABLE accounts are funded with private dollars, meaning money from the person with a disability or their family or friends or what have you, and they're ruled by federal law. So they generally move very easily with someone from state to state. The ARC of Northern Virginia operates a special needs trust, and we serve people primarily in DC, Maryland, and Virginia, but we have thousands of people who have trusts with us. And when those folks move to another part of the state or the country or the world, in some cases, we are happy to keep working with them. Obviously, you can have Zoom meetings and emails and electronic funds distributions and things like that from all over the world at any time. At times we can figure out are convenient for people. So for the most part, a special needs trust or an ABLE account can work with you. ABLE accounts are state specific. They're similar to special needs trust, a savings vehicle. They have some advantages and some disadvantages compared to special needs trust that I think are worth looking into. And that's a whole kind of separate conversation, but I'm happy to send resources or talk about that if folks have questions. But at the end of the day, ABLE accounts are state-based, but even if you lived in, I don't know, Idaho now, you could set up a Virginia ABLE account if you felt the Virginia ABLE account was more advantageous to you. ABLE accounts have only been around for a good handful of years now, relative to special needs trusts that have been around for decades. So ABLE accounts from state to state are not wildly different, but there was a time just a few years ago where, for example, some states had put in place ABLE accounts and other states hadn't yet. So some people set up an ABLE account in a state where they didn't live and never intended to live because they thought that was the best savings vehicle for them and that state had an account. So that's the kind of thing you would talk where your account is and make sure that, can you still connect with them as you need to? Are they still responsive? But there shouldn't be any reason that those kinds of accounts can't continue moving and working with someone no matter where they live. Okay, so now I want to talk through quickly some of the questions we get often about moving. So I need to move because I have to see this person more, right? Their needs are changing or whatever's going on. So the first thing, knowing what we know about Virginia, is if the person lives in a nearby state, can you move them closer to Virginia, but still within their state? Can they move to the eastern part of Tennessee or Kentucky, the southern part of Maryland, a different neighborhood in DC, the northern part of North Carolina. In other words, can we try and keep in place not only their federal, but their state resources and still get them closer to you? Or can you do a better job of leveraging virtual visits? Is there another way to see them on a regular basis that would be an option? We get a lot of concerns about service quality. You know, like I want to move my loved one because the services we're getting aren't great. I would say moving out of state should not be a first resort. First, talk to whoever their service team is where they are, right? Say, is there another service provider we could select? Another residential option we could look at? Or do you want to hire a private advocate, like a private case manager where that person is, to do checkups, to help run meetings, to help know the system where that person is and help them navigate things? I can certainly recommend advocates who do that in Virginia, and other ARCs can recommend advocates who do that in other parts of the state or the country. Sometimes we hear the whole family is moving. Well, it's important to think about if this person with a disability is an adult, they should have the same choice as all other adults, right? Even though their family is moving, and that's an incredibly important natural support. If everything that they rely on to be safe, happy, and healthy, like paid staff, job supports, medical care, an integrated home, transportation network, is here, does it make sense to move them? And it can be a really hard conversation, but it shouldn't be an assumption that the person's got to move because everyone else says. We often are hearing from adult siblings where parents are passing away or no longer able to provide care, and they're saying, well, then shouldn't the person come to live with me? Yes, only if those resources would transition so easily with the person, and now we know they don't. So that's another time when it makes sense to get in touch with the person's resource team where they are. If there are more resources we can add in now that mom and dad aren't in the picture, can we hire a private advocate? Can we leverage virtual support so I can still be more a part of their care from a distance if it doesn't make sense to move them? Or we have to move because of work. Then, like I talked about, some people, instead of saying, I've got a job in Northern Virginia, I need to live in Northern Virginia, say, I've got a job in Northern Virginia, I'm going to live in Maryland, right? Or make some of those kinds of strategic decisions. If you're working in an area where localities or states may be significantly different, then think about that. And like I talked about, Arlington, Alexandria, Fairfax generally provide more local resources. So if you have to move within Northern Virginia, a move from Fairfax County to Prince William, which in some cases is right across a highway, makes a really big difference in the services someone can get. So it's worth thinking about, you know, what are the real consequences of that move? So as promised, I'll put my information up here, which is thearcofnova.org/answers. And that'll take you to our website where you can ask a question, and it only comes to me, and I will happily respond to you. We have a 2-page guide that walks over the same kind of topics we did in today's webinar that I often send folks who are moving. I'm happy to send you links to the United Cerebral Palsy reports or the State of the States or anything you need. We have some really big guidebooks and toolkits called our transition guides for every stage of life, everything from early intervention through aging with a disability. And the links for those are on the screen too. thearcofnova.org/programs/transition will take you there, and those will give you the big picture look at any stage in life. What are all the things I should know and how to put them in place and those kinds of things. So here's some other good resources to know about. The link at the top here is for the Case for Inclusion, that report that compares states. And the next report down is the State of the States, where it doesn't so much compare states, it gives you a good report on each state that you would have to compare on your own to others. There's a link there to find your local housing authority if you're looking at transferring a housing voucher. There's some basic information on Virginia's services and our Department of Justice settlement at mylifemycommunityvirginia.org. And then the ARC of Northern Virginia has a very large online resource library for supported decision-making. So building up your team, alternatives to guardianship, powers of attorney, those kinds of things. The last link at the bottom is an email for a man named Eric Jorgensen. He is based in Maryland, but one of his areas of expertise is helping people move across the country and navigate services from state to state. I don't know of anybody else who does that. So what I often tell families is, when you know what state you're settling in, contact that state ARC. And if you know a locality, contact the local ARC too. Sometimes state and local ARCs have different focuses or different resources or different areas. Be in touch with everybody, but he's a great privately hired resource to really have someone who can walk you through on a more one-on-one basis as opposed to giving general information. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen here, and I'll go ahead and start moving to some of the questions that folks have put in. Okay, can I provide links to these presentations? Yes, so that's what just came up. And then if you, they should, like I said, I'll send you the slides if you're attending this live. And if you're watching this later, they are easy to search for on the internet. So United Cerebral Palsy Case for Inclusion, or University of Colorado's State of the States. But the links there are on that last slide too. What part of Alexandria have local state funding, I believe? Okay, is that what's that asking? What parts of Alexandria? So Alexandria is odd in that Fairfax County has a part of Fairfax County where people's address is Alexandria, Virginia. Right next to that is the city of Alexandria, where addresses are also Alexandria, Virginia. So if you're looking at one of those two, make sure you know which it is. Both of those Alexandrias, if you will, the Fairfax part of Alexandria and the separate city of Alexandria, offer local funding. In my experience, Fairfax County's part of Alexandria, that funding is more robust and a little bit more flexible. In comparison, their population is many, many, many times larger than the city of Alexandria. So their scale and their work is just very different. If my child doesn't have a special needs program at his neighborhood school, can he go to a different school outside his neighborhood? That is an IEP team decision. So placement is always going to be determined by the IEP team. So parents can come in and say, we don't think that his base school is a good fit for these reasons. The IEP team may counter and say, well, let's try it these ways, or what services can we put in place to make the local school work, or the other kinds of things, or they may agree that another program is beneficial, but that's a group decision. And like I talked about, parents can hire advocates or attorneys to help them navigate that decision, but it's not something that either the schools can choose on their own or the parents can choose on their own. Oh, my little boy photobombing. Thanks for being a good sport, everybody. Okay, so how do I find an advocate? So that's the kind of information that I'm happy to send to people. The trust team that we have at the ARC of Northern Virginia has a group of paid advocates on that team. It was initially set up to be for folks who had trust with us, but everyone needs that service at some point. So over the years, that's been expanded to really anybody who needs it. So if you go to the arcofnovatrust.org, and then go to the contact us or about us section, you can fill out a form to get contacted by one of our advocates. There's another group in Northern Virginia called Inclusion Consultants, run by a woman named Nancy Mercer, who was our executive director when I began at the ARC of Northern Virginia many years ago. So if you do an internet search for Inclusion Consultants, either Northern Virginia or add Nancy Mercer, I believe their website is inclusionconsultants.com or .net or something like that. But you'll know right away if you see Nancy Mercer's name on there and it's tied to Northern Virginia. And she's another person who does kind of disability specific private help navigating resources and services. Okay, so we got a question here, about stimulus checks. So our son received a stimulus check, and those were the checks that came to people over the course of the pandemic through federal funding. We were told he needs to spend it down in 1 year. That is true. If it is not spent in 1 year, whatever account it's in, we'll start counting it as an asset. And it means if they puts them over the limit for things like Medicaid or Social Security, that's a problem. Can he put that in a special needs trust? Yes, absolutely. That money is now his, and he can move that into a special needs trust. He can either establish one with that money and then put the remainder of the money in there, or if he already has a special needs trust, he can put it in. How do you track down data related to inquiries I receive from families considering to move away from Virginia? I have a very large spreadsheet that I fill out all day, every day with the kinds of contacts that we get and the ways that I'm responding to people and those kinds of things. I've been at the ARC of Northern Virginia since 2008, then off for a year, then back since 2010. So I have a very good sense of trends and inquiries over time. I answer almost every single frontline inquiry that comes into the ARC of Northern Virginia, unless someone's already working with our guardianship or case management or trust team. And we have spent a lot of the time that I've been here developing one-pagers and guidebooks and recorded sessions and things like that based upon the questions we get most. So I can also go back and see how many times particular videos and documents were viewed and used as a good cue for how often we get this. And we chose to run this session in the summer because we know so many families, either military or foreign service, or trying to work around school systems move in the summer. Okay. You really have to establish an address before applying for services in your school and community. Yes, because the first question they're going to ask is, where do you live? Because we need to make sure you're eligible for services in this county or state. And if you say, well, I'm just planning to move there, then they don't have any way to say, well, here's what eligibility is like in that county or that state, right? So you're going to need an address and a way to contact them and be receptive to information at that address. California has regional centers. Yes, we hear about these a lot, which tend to act as one-stop shop for services in Virginia. Is there something comparable in Virginia? What a great question, Heather. Not truly, not a real fair comparison to a regional center that really offers support services. The closest hub in Virginia would be what are called community services boards. Virginia as a state is geographically relatively large, and there are 40 community services boards that cover the state. Within Northern Virginia, if you live in Fairfax, you work with the Fairfax Community Services Board. Prince William, Arlington, Alexandria, Loudoun, all of those places have their own community services board. In some of the more rural counties and smaller places in Virginia, there may be one community services board that covers a very large geographic area, but that is the place that you would make a frontline call to apply for a waiver, for example, or ask about respite services or local funding. With that being said, if you weren't otherwise eligible for their services, meaning if you weren't getting a waiver and getting a case manager, they wouldn't also help you apply for Medicaid. They wouldn't also help you get funding for services like respite, like they do in California's regional centers. So it's a much more scaled down version of local help. Do we know if there are inclusive preschools in Northern Virginia? Yes, absolutely. So I chose the preschool when my daughter first started going to preschool because when I toured, there were kids wearing hearing aids and kids having seizures. And that was where I felt comfortable having her being, though she had a lot of sensory issues and no clear diagnosis. I thought this is an inclusive setting. So by and large, if you tour preschools, you are going to find that all preschools to some degree or another serve kids with disabilities. With that being said, there's a preschool called Green Tree Christian Preschool in Fairfax Station, Virginia, that's run through a church that is designed to be an inclusive preschool, meaning that they are very careful about numbers and making sure that they're recruiting students. There's an Easter Seals Child Development Center that is also an inclusive preschool based in Falls Church, Virginia, and they do a lot of work on inclusion as well. For families who live in Arlington, Arlington County has a preschool program for children in what would then be Child Find. So the follow-on to early intervention, the Child Find program, who are eligible for school services at age 4 and are getting county preschool, and they make sure that that county-based preschool is inclusive. So there are other options beyond that. And a lot of preschools, like I said, just by nature of serving kids, end up being inclusive, but I'm happy to talk with folks more in depth if they have other questions about that. We have the mechanism for a special needs trust set up. Will we contact the ARC about funding the trust and managing the money? Yes, absolutely. So at the arcofnovatrust.org, at the top, there's a little tab that says events, and our trust team does like 3 to 6 free virtual events a month, now virtual because of the pandemic, where you can tune in and like ask questions, find resources, say like, if I have this, does this make sense? Those kinds of things. And then they'll set up free one-on-one consultations for folks who come to those and then kind of talk a little bit in more depth and get things up and running for you. Okay, our programs like Woodrow Wilson Center in Virginia with dorms or housing. So this question is referring to, remember I talked about all state agencies have a vocational rehab, a job helping program for people with disabilities. Virginia's is called DARS. A lot of Virginia's DARS services are locally based, meaning the person who would help you find a job and meet with you. A lot of our job training programs are in a rural western part of Virginia called Fishersville at a big building called the Woodrow Wilson Rehab Center. It is possible to have a relatively short couple of days or a week stay there for an assessment or a training class, or even a couple of months to practice independent living. That is the only place in Virginia that does that. We as an ARC network have been pushing really hard to say that doesn't make a whole lot of sense for this very large state to have one rural area where they do those kinds of supports, but we haven't had tremendous luck yet. Okay, and then I got another question that says, are there any other, but ellipses afterwards? So if you want to add in more to that, feel free. I'll go ahead and look at our chat and we'll wrap up here in just a second. All right, a special needs trust is new to me. My son is 5. Is this something I should start for him? Would it be a benefit in general? Yes, I would say definitely start it for him. And it's a benefit insofar as so many programs like Medicaid and waiver and whatnot won't take into account how much money he has until he's 18. But you also don't want to wait till he's 18 to start saving or planning or funding, because you certainly don't want to be under the gun for both trying to put services in place and then trying to line up a trust so he's eligible at the same time, right? We have a lot of families who set up a special needs trust with us with no money in it and just use it essentially as a shell, so that if a grandparent is going to leave an inheritance, and obviously we don't know when that's going to happen, or someone's going to give money for a birthday, or the person's going to get money from a settlement or a back payment from Social Security, or whatever the situation is, there's a vehicle there ready to catch it right away, so that that process is really seamless and we never risk jeopardizing someone's benefits or anything like that. Certainly as a person ages, it's going to be of tremendous benefits. And lots of folks write, like I said, wills or life insurance policies or other end of life documents to fund the special needs trust, and that's perfectly fine. I will wrap up our recording today since we are out of time, and thank you all for coming, and remind you that at the arcofnova.org/answers, anytime you can be in touch with me. So thank you all for being here.